calling for a ceasefire is like calling for the United States to stand down and do a ceasefire on September 12th, 2001. That's just not realistic, and it's not right.
The Middle East Monitor was set up more than 14 years ago as a press monitoring platform, and today we're looking at how the international press is propagating a campaign led by the US government against a ceasefire in Gaza.
What are the chances of a Gaza ceasefire? None. No possibility.
We start with Fox News, the most watched news channel in the US, represents Republican, right-wing America, and is unsurprisingly in line with the Israeli government.
I see that the president of France is calling for a ceasefire. Right. The Israelis should ignore him completely. That is an immoral position from Emmanuel Macron. It's shameful.
Flicking over to one of the world's most watched news channels, CNN, their primetime anchor, Jake Tapper, is cheerleading for the Biden administration's position on a ceasefire, first lauding Hillary Clinton's recent speech.
People who are calling for a ceasefire now do not understand Hamas. That is not possible. It would be such a gift to Hamas.
Tapper tries to frame the millions of protesters across the world calling for a ceasefire as naive and ill-informed.
From the point of view of Israel, they hear all the calls for a ceasefire. What they do not hear is anyone in the international community proposing any way for them to get back their 240 hostages.
What Tapper doesn't mention is that many Israelis are now calling for a ceasefire, including the families of the 240 kidnapped hostages. All the most prestigious liberal newspapers repeat this sentiment. An editorial in the Washington Post says, "A unilateral or unconditional ceasefire by Israel would be inconsistent with the country's right to defend itself against Hamas," adding, "Nor would it be morally and politically appropriate to put the entire onus of civilian casualties on Israel." The Post is right there. The US and its cheerleaders in the media have also played a part, but I'm not sure that's what they meant. Why a ceasefire in Gaza is unrealistic reads the title of an article in The Atlantic, the main periodical of the American liberal intelligentsia. The Atlantic article is keen to repeat Hillary Clinton's description of a ceasefire as a victory for Hamas. A ceasefire now will reinforce the success Hamas, claims to have achieved on 7th of October. A victory to Hamas would allow the movement to believe that the world will defend it whenever it decides to attack Israel. The author speaks as though more than 10,000 haven't died in Gaza, as well as a reported 1,700 Palestinian fighters in Israel. Given the level of death and destruction, very few in Gaza would see a ceasefire, even now, as a victory for anyone. Most of these articles start and end the same way. We too were shedding tears for the Palestinians. The airstrikes and killings should stop, but only if it doesn't empower Hamas. So what's the alternative? US President Biden has supposedly secured a deal with Israel for humanitarian pauses in the bombing, but Oxfam, as was widely reported across the media, has thoroughly debunked the humanitarian pauses, safe zones and corridors being promoted by the US. Firstly, Oxfam say none of these should be needed because it is already illegal to target civilians and civilian infrastructure, or deny them aid, food and water, as the Israelis are doing. Oxfam also say corridors and pauses are fragile and often ignored, as in Syria and Ukraine, and they're effectively voluntary. There are no specific laws around them. Safe zones can be even more dangerous for civilians, as it's hard to access credible information in times of war. While much of the international press tries to discredit a ceasefire as naive, people on the ground in Gaza and in Israel are crying out for an end to the violence, and the international movement to demand a ceasefire and end the occupation of Palestine grows each week.